Eric, how the heck are you, man? Thanks for doing this. Excited to just kind of pick your brain on some stuff, and
Yeah, man.
yeah, man, ready to chat and just kind of see what God's been up to in your life and in your ministry and just your church. And so, dude, how the heck did you get into youth ministry and end up where you what you're doing now, leading this big bad youth ministry at Southland?
Yeah. So I didn't really grow up in the church. Kind of did, but not really. So my view of church for a really long time was like we went to church where my grandparents went to church. Grew up in Kansas in the Wichita area, and so we went to church where my grandparents went to church, and I just thought it was just something you did. Like Monday through Friday, you go to school. Sunday, you go to church, and you sit through it, and then you go about the rest of your day. So that was really my view of church for a long time. And then as I got like older, like later elementary school into middle school, was doing a lot of travel, soccer stuff, things like that. So it just wasn't really a priority for us. And I thought that's what like being good with God was if you sat in a church, like that's all. So that kind of changed in high school. Our neighbors invited us to a church that was not new, but they were moving into a new building that everybody on our side of town had been seeing kind of being built up, things like that. And so, um, and it was kind of nice that it was actually like in our neighborhood. My grandparents' church was like on the other side of town, which is like only like 25 minutes away. But, any town you're in, you kind of assume the other side of town is like you need a passport to get there kind of a thing. And so,
I have a
uh,
car. I've never been out. I don't go. I don't know
I
if they have their
know.
own Walmart. I just don't do it.
Yeah, and so my parents wanted to go check it out, so we started going. They really enjoyed it, but we just kind of stayed in church, sort of a thing. Like I never went to like their youth group. But then the neighbors that invited us to come were actually high school leaders, and so they had been extending the invitation. Hey, you should really come check out high school stuff. You should come check out high school stuff. And so finally, I did, and it was the Sunday morning right after that high school group had gotten back from like a CIY summer conference, and a couple things like really stood out. Uh, one, I actually knew these kids because like they went to school with me and stuff, and I wasn't like super great friends with a lot of them, like, but some of us were pretty cool at school with each other. I always knew something was a little bit different about them, but didn't really know what it was. So there was something about seeing my peers actually in a church setting that was a new thing for me, and then also just seeing students that actually had a genuine growing faith and getting to see that on display, like in the way that they worshiped and the way that they treated each other and things like that. So I was intrigued, and started going to that youth ministry on a regular basis. Finally kind of clicked for me. uh, Gave my life to Christ towards the end of my freshman year in high school, and then from there I just jumped all in, man. Like I went and was a part of everything that they could offer. I
Hmm.
started serving, started going on trips, got really, really involved. And it was kind of through a lot of that that I just developed a deep love for the church. Um, and out of that, like when you're kind of in your junior, senior year of high school, sometimes you can take classes that get you out of school to go do like community service, things like that. I did that at my church, and I had youth pastors that they didn't just give me grunt work to do. They invited me in on like dreaming and planning, and they were in the process of building a new student center at that time. And I got to like research things that were going to go into that student center and think strategically about that. And I was like 16, 17, 18 years old.
That's
And so I
huge.
think what God was doing in that season was really starting to not just help me develop a love for the church, but start to really like cultivate a calling to serve the church. And so, um, yeah, going into my senior year, had a plan that I was going to go to Kansas State University because that's where my girlfriend was going. And my girlfriend I met in youth group. She was a year older than me. So my senior year, we were long distance. She was in Manhattan. I was down in Wichita. But then, because of what God was doing in my heart in the church, and just a lot of other influence from youth pastors and even other friends at the time too, found out about Manhattan Christian College and the opportunities they had there with like a dual degree program sort of a thing. So that's what I was going to do, because it was like, man, I could go continue to fulfill this like love for the Bible and the church that's developing, but then I can still do like the practical thing. And I was going to go get like a business degree or something like that. But then my
Yeah.
senior year, after I graduated, that was the plan. I went to camp for the first time as a leader, and I was a middle school group leader. And that was the first time I got to like help walk a student through the process of what it looked like for him to surrender his life to Jesus.
Wow.
And I just remember after getting to pray with that student and encourage him and sitting there while he called his mom and dad to tell them about that and then sending him to his cabin. I just kind of had some alone time that night. And I just felt like a very clear sense from the Lord, like, this is what you're supposed to do with your life. And
Mm.
so
I always tell
packed
all of our
up.
group leaders, man, I'm like, look, if you, I tell them all when they first come on, I'm like, my goal is to get you to baptize a kid as soon as you can. Obviously, not like
Yeah.
force it, because I'm like, if you do, it'll change your life.
Yeah.
When you are an integral part of leading someone to Jesus, like you're hooked. Like you just catch
Yeah.
that vision for making disciples, and like I can do
Yeah.
this. I don't have to be like a pastor. I don't have to be like a missionary. I'm a normal Christian that can like share the hope of Jesus and watch the lights come on. I'm like,
Yeah.
there's nothing better. I would love that.
Yeah. And so I basically, I was already going to Manhattan to do the dual degree thing, but I did that for about like the first part of my first semester and then just dropped the whole K State thing and jumped full into youth ministry, preaching, all that other stuff too, and got a lot of different experiences to serve the church in a lot of different contexts while I was there. The girl that I started dating in youth group became my wife. So I love telling that story to students because I can't ever really tell students, dude, you shouldn't date in high school because honestly, it worked out pretty good for me. So I don't want to be a hypocrite. So,
I always
um,
drop the good, better, best line. I'm like, she may be
yeah,
good, but is she what's best? Is she? I mean, is there something that's better? Is that what's
yeah,
best right now? I can't tell you
yeah.
that. And the
She was
kids are
my
like,
best.
dang, I don't
So
know, man. Oh
yeah, it's
yeah, she's
wild.
what was best, baby.
I didn't know that I was going to meet my wife when I was 15 and started going to church, but I did. And so really grateful for that. But out of the end of college, had some different opportunities to consider as far as like what getting started in ministry looked like. I had done my internship as a part of my degree over the summer into my senior year. Pretty large church, youth ministry stuff. I was out in Las Vegas for that. That had kind of opened some doors for some potential opportunities more out west. And then had a former youth pastor of mine, one of those guys who was pretty integral in my calling, kind of developing back in Kansas, who had gone on to staff at a church in Phoenix at CCV. And he had called me to ask about if I'd be interested in starting with an internship out of college instead of going into like, trying to find a job, basically. And I think I was pretty cocky about myself that I was like, man, I think I can just do this. Like, I don't, but also on the flip side, there's something, I'm a pretty loyal person in a lot of ways. And there's something about somebody who was such a big part of my life saying, hey, I'm pretty new here too. And I trust you. And I'd
Amazing.
love to do some of this alongside you. And so that kind of sealed it. And so we packed up everything we could in our two cars and we moved to Phoenix, Arizona, did an internship in youth ministry there. That internship ended and that kind of turned into my first position in student ministry, getting hired onto the team out there. Did something like as a support role on like their at the time, and it still is, like their largest campus like youth staff. I was like a high school associate pastor. Then pretty quickly, after a little bit of a short time, they were in the process of getting ready to launch one of their multi-site campuses in Scottsdale, and I got asked to kind of go help. Like pretty shortly after that, it started. Kind of go and kind of take that really from a lot of it's not the full-on like inception, but still really early on, and do both junior high and high school there, and did that for almost 2 years, and then just kind of some things kind of shifted just with their strategy and like what I wasn't really sure was the best fit for my calling, and just some other things that kind of ended a little more abruptly than I would have liked even to. Um, and it just kind of led us to like, okay, we're going somewhere else, and cast a really, really wide net. Heard about some opportunities at this church in Lexington, Kentucky. Had never been there before, but just really hit it off in a lot of conversations. And came here, loved the people, loved the place, and just really found ourselves seeing like, man, this could be what's next. And that was 10 years ago now, almost.
Holy
And
smokes!
so,
So yeah, talk us through the last 10 years. Like what's God been up
yeah,
to
yeah,
at your church in the youth ministry? I mean, how have you seen God work? I would love to just maybe hear a few stories,
yeah,
just of what God's been doing in your ministry, man.
yeah. So when I came here, I came to lead the middle school and high school ministry at one of our campuses that is pretty big, but it's also like right kind of in the heart of the city. It's in like downtown Lexington, basically. And so I did that for about 6 years, doing both middle school and high school. As those grew, I focused just on high school while we hired somebody to lead the middle school side of things. And then about 3.5 years ago, just through like the experience that I had, just other doors opening and stuff, that turned into more of a role of me, like leading our team of student pastors and our central support team that really tries to help equip everything that's happening at the campus level and things like that. So that's been a unique change for me just in the last like 3.5 years, because I'm sure this has probably come up in other conversations you've had. Everybody always wants to ask a youth pastor, hey, what are you going to do after youth ministry? I've never had an answer for that question. My answer to that was probably more youth ministry. It's just going to look different. And that's kind of the season that I'm in right now. But it's been fun because as I moved into this role, it was in the process of, we were a multi-site church. We still are a multi-site church, but we really were in the process of shifting from, hey, let's keep identifying communities that we can put more Southland campuses in, to, hey, we're actually going to stop where we are at these five that are within this like 1 hour radius of Lexington, and we're going to get back into church planting. And so,
Amazing.
which is awesome, and it's really cool, and honestly it's really awesome for me in my role, because now I get to really just lean in and invest in our five communities that we're in with our team, as opposed to always thinking like, how do we replicate this as we go further and further away, as we add more sites and things like that. I don't think that would be really in my wheelhouse to always be that strategic all the time. um, I think it would probably remove me from people even a little bit more than I like, and probably too much time in the car driving all over Kentucky. And so that's been a fun thing to be a part of in this season, is when I moved into that role was right at kind of the outset of saying, hey, we're actually going to press pause on looking for more sites, all these other things. And we really want to get back to a church planting model, which I get to support some of that in a little bit, but honestly, I'm pretty hands off with a lot of the church planting stuff. And outside of encouraging those guys as they start student ministries and things like that, that's really about it. So that's kind of the season we're in right now. We have five campuses that are growing in a lot of really really cool ways. All of them have their own different unique aspects to them, and I get to just come alongside and coach and encourage, and also just make sure that even if they look very different in five different communities, that we're all still chasing towards the same thing, and that we're also staying in line with where we're heading as a church and things like that.
What do you guys when you talk about chasing the same thing? I mean,
Yeah.
the word that comes to my mind is vision.
Yep.
How do you paint and articulate the vision of your youth ministry in a way that makes sense to your youth pastors and your big? You guys have a big youth team,
Yep.
but also trickle down into the volunteers to the kids. How do you guys articulate that? How do you cast that vision? Because I think that's really tough. That's been a big
Mm-hmm.
theme that I feel like the more youth pastors I'm talking to, the more people, everybody does that differently. So that's
Yeah.
a repeat question that I've asked other people on the show. That's been
Yeah.
really interesting to see because I think as leaders, that's probably our number one job, right? Is to keep
Yeah.
the vision clear, to keep casting it, and to find more and more
Mm-hmm.
compelling ways to do that. So how do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think keeping it as simple as possible is my thing. I'm just not that smart, like to be constantly trying to recraft things and coming up with like 10 different ways to say the same thing. So we've tried to just say the same thing. And honestly, that's where we try to just follow the lead of our church as a whole. And so all those different things are really good gauges. The one difference that we kind of added a tagline to the front of our vision for our student ministry that's, I guess, different from what we do when it comes to like our church as a whole. But we want to help students find belonging so that they can live life with Jesus in community and on mission. So the with Jesus in community on mission is probably like another variation of what every church has in some way, shape, or form, like up, in, out, whatever you want, like all those different, acronyms and stuff like that
Right.
too. But for us, the gauge we always want to look at it through is, are we creating environments that help students find belonging? And that then helps us understand that, man, this is a place that students can belong before they believe. But can they belong? And is it relational enough that they want to belong and not just show up and kind of do something individually and things like that? So a lot of the things that we're always kind of asking questions around, like the way our groups are set up, the way we program things, like the way we even set up our rooms and stuff, is it relational? Is it too easy for a student to isolate themselves if they need to? Do we have who we need to just make students feel like they're so welcome here? And in so many other different ways. And the cool thing about that, we have a lot of different students who belong well before they believe and get to really invest in them long term in that, which is really, really cool. But then the other part of that, this has probably been a little more recent for me that I've been trying to really keep in front of our team, is when they do believe, like when they belong, like they belong before they can believe, but when they do start to really believe, are we equipping them to know how to continue to do that beyond this season of life where there's something designed for their age group? Because we just started to see a lot of students that were
Oh yeah.
leaving, and they were leaving a lot more than just our church. And that's not a Southland problem. That's a church problem. That's a youth ministry problem. But it really just kind of messed with me. And honestly, I was thinking and praying through that for a season. And if you'll go with me here, this was kind of the analogy that God kind of used to really wake me up to this. But I was sitting in an airport and had a long layover, and I was just sitting there and I was kind of watching people go by because people watching is fun. And I was in front of one of those moving sidewalks, like the moving sidewalks that some people, I don't know if anybody that actually just stands on them, but a lot of times people are walking on them.
I don't. I'm always like, bro, you keep walking on this. I despise
Yeah,
the people. If you're a stander on the movie thing, on the
yeah, yeah,
you need to get your butt on the right because I'm
yeah,
hauling on the left.
yeah. So, anyways, the part about that, I was sitting on the side just watching these people go by on this, but there was a stander and they were locked in on something completely different. They were on their phone, whatever. It got to the end, because they all end, and they didn't know it was ending, and they fell.
Please. Oh no, man.
And honestly, I felt bad for the person first. I laughed a little bit on the inside when I realized they were okay. But
Come on, preach,
then
Eric. I know where this is going.
I know this is a classic youth pastor thing. So
Preach,
I kind of
baby, preach.
realized, man, we have students on something that's been designed to move them forward. And that's not a bad thing. But if we're not teaching them how to walk, when it ends, if they're not walking and taking steps out on their own, they're going to fall on their face. And so that shifted a lot of our thought processes with, like, man, we have to start handing the keys over, and we have to start teaching them how to do this instead of just receiving it constantly. And I think there's some value in that when we think about both middle school and high school. Man, middle school, they need that structure. Like, they need to just know, hey, you're on something that's moving you towards Jesus, and it's okay to just be a part of it for now. But as you're a part of it, and the longer you're a part of it, even if it's not just in middle school, even if you're just new coming in into high school, like, we want you on it. But the goal should always be to get you to start walking. So that way, when that day comes, when high school's over, and maybe your church has a college ministry and then a young adults ministry and then a whatever ministry, you got to learn how to just be a part of the church at some point. And so that's shifted some of what we've been doing. And it's all through that lens of, man, we want them to belong here, but then how are we also teaching them to walk on their own?
Yeah.
So,
Well,
and I
I
could
would
go into a
love
lot
to
of
get in.
strategy on that, but ultimately that's what I keep coming back to. Like, is it helping them, like, get on? And is it, like, is the end goal still to get them off and for them to be able to walk off and continue on their own?
Well, can we just unpack that? Because I would love to talk about both of those components. Because I think,
Yeah.
like, isn't that what everyone's trying to do? We're
Mm-hmm.
all trying to figure out, like, yeah, how do we help people get on, and how do we help them, like,
Yeah.
continue to, like you said, get off and continue to thrive. So, uh, maybe we just start on the front end. What would have been some, like, I don't want to say like keys to success, but at the same time, like, I'm sure that you've got some of those things distilled, that you've solved the same problem over and over again at your different campuses and are continuously dialing in what that looks like. Um, when it comes to creating compelling environments for people to belong, because I mean, I completely agree with you. I tell everybody my greatest frustration of ministry is when I see kids come and I see them not connecting. And I'm just
Yeah.
like, it kills me. I'm like, I wish that if I could wave a magic wand and do anything, I would be like, they just walk in here and bling, you have six
Yeah.
friends and that you love being here regardless. And then, like, because I know that if you have the community piece, like,
Yeah.
you'll keep coming and you'll be compelled to be here because you're
Yeah.
loved. Because I believe that the longer you're here, the power of God's word and the power of the gospel will draw them into worship, and through that will draw them to mission. Like, I
Yeah.
really believe that, but it's super hard to do. So, what does it look like for you guys? How do you coach your team? What have been some
Yeah.
problems you've seen, and how have you walked them through that? And because I
Yeah.
think that's going to be a fascinating conversation for listeners.
Yeah, so I mean, environment matters. Like that's a big piece of it too, and just like having like a really close eye on for anybody walking through these doors. Like, is it actually like a wide open door that's really, really accessible for anybody? And so, but then part of that is like thinking through the lens of, is it relational? You know, there's things that we set up that it's like, man, if we're gonna put chairs down, outside of like our programming space, which honestly, if some could, I'd probably recommend that they all kind of be more in circles and not in rows and that whole analogy. But any other like open space that students want to hang out in before they come, man, can they be on their own? Like the places to sit, like, are there more circles, things like that? Even like some of our rooms have like a video game setup and things like that. And we're like, hey, we don't want to put anything in here that's just easy for a kid to isolate and play this on their own, or everything is done like, so all the stuff is just like, man, is this easy? But then also making sure that there's somebody there to help initiate that for even if a kid does kind of come in on their own, and making sure that we've got people that are strategically placed throughout that. So like one thing that we're in the process of making sure that a lot of our campuses are kind of more on the same page with this is the one thing we always want to do when we get our leaders together is we also want to huddle them up. We want to talk through things and stuff like that. But a lot of times that was bleeding over into when our students were starting to really show up. And so more and more of our campuses are like, man, we need to disseminate the information that we need to give to our leaders in another way, because we need those people in place to receive students and to be those initiators. That's one thing. Another thing too is really like any student leadership that we have going on, they kind of take more ownership in what we do to really kind of include students that maybe they don't know, and like they know when they're on, because they're student leaders, that their default isn't like, what am I necessarily getting out of this, but it's more of how do I kind of own the environment to the way that people are going to be. I was just talking to a senior who's here interning with us down the hall, and he was asking me about a freshman guy um, that he got connected with at the table that he was leading at high school ministry the other night. And he's a senior. He's not one of our adult leaders. And so it's some of that ownership piece, which is just a really, really big deal for me personally, of how you give ownership to students to be a part of it. And we can talk about that more later. But yeah, just, are there spots, and like actively looking at it, like sometimes taking a step, say, hey, I'm going to give away some of my responsibility so I can just look at this more from a 30,000 foot view, to say, is everything we're doing relational? Because if it's not, then we're not going to be the widest open door for any student who wants to come in here and potentially hear about Jesus.
I think that that's like a misconception, that it's only like, oh, and I think, like, I'm not saying you're saying this. I found myself thinking like, oh, we need to be hyper relational for the non-Christian kids,
Yeah.
right? For the unconnected, for the whatever you want to say. You're using your language, like, and I'm always thinking about like the non-believer, skeptical kid coming in for the first time is the stereotype. But
Yeah.
but I think the magic of that, of like the community side, the belonging, like that's
Yeah.
just as important to the kid who's grown up in church, knows all the stories, knows everything, as much as the kid who doesn't know anything, doesn't is skeptical and doesn't trust the church and doesn't
Yeah.
trust institutionalized religion. It's like, I think it's
Yeah.
almost not like it's almost more important, but like, at least I've seen that Like I've seen more skeptical non-Christian kids stick around, not quite having
Yeah.
the friendships yet because they're interested in the truth and they're searching for God. But
Yeah.
like I think like that community aspect is almost even not like more important, but like almost more evident where I've seen kids drop
Yeah.
off more, the kids that know all the right answers. But the
Yep.
kids that have grown up in the church, they're like, I just don't know if I belong here. Like I don't know
Yeah.
if I have a place here. So
Yeah.
that's
And then also
huge.
just, and I think the willingness to also look at the way that you do things and kind of look at it through, man, is this actually relational for like the age group is also another thing too. Middle schoolers love to be told what to do. Like they might act like they don't, but they actually really crave that structure in a lot of ways. But one of the things that we were starting to realize with our high school students, and this is probably a little bit more of an example of like, man, we had to really look at this and it led to a lot of work and we're still not totally there yet. And like, we feel like it's like flawless and it probably never will be. But one of the things we were doing with our high school, and this was a shift we made, this will be our third school year this next year going into this model. So our groups part of what we do in our ministry was always attached directly to the program. So first hour was a service, second hour was your small groups. We send them off into all the nooks and crannies of the church. It's a pretty common thing. And that's still what we do in middle school. But in high school, what we started to realize, students not wanting to include their actual friends that don't come to church as much, because when groups were always that big, wide open nature and things like that too, like, man, it might change our group dynamic. Like that's a problem. You have something that's actively keeping students from wanting to invite people to come to your open door, which is Wednesday nights, because that was so closely tied together. Another thing too, man, high school especially is an age group where who you hang out with has so fewer qualifiers than it does when you're younger. It's not weird to be friends with people that are older than you. You might play sports with them. And so it's like, yeah, I might be a sophomore, but I've actually connected with some of these guys on my team that are seniors. Or like, and granted, it might be because they're interested in dating them or whatever, but it's also like, man, gender isn't even like as much of a qualifier on who you're friends with. And so what would happen is we were seeing new students come, and what we were doing, because everything was so tied with our group's aspect of that, we were pulling them away from the people that brought them to put them in a group that matched their gender and age on a night that's supposed to be our widest open door. And so that's why what we actually did was we shifted our second hour for high school to be what we call connection time. And it's a lot more kind of open and free flowing. We still try to get them in circles where there can be relational wins and stuff, but we're not going to pull you away from the person that you came with. We're kind of opening that
Cool.
up so that way, man, I can't think of a better place than the church for students to learn how to have like healthy platonic friendships, you know, and that
Right.
can be an outlet for that. And then for the I hate this word, but like deeper, if you will, like discipleship oriented. We're learning how to study the Bible, equipping them for those kind of things. We can still have those safeguards, but we're going to take those away from the program. And we went back into homes. Um, and so, and like I said, home groups are not a new idea. They're not a new
Did you
model. A lot.
immediately? Yeah, I'm sure you're going there. I was just going to ask. Like, I'm guessing every time we've done that, and we still have a group component on our Wednesday nights because we do Wednesday night programming
Yep.
at Legacy at my church I'm at. But anytime we're in the home, the quality of that, like
Yeah.
the hunger, the interest, everything is like 10x.
Yeah.
What is that?
Yeah.
What did that look like for you guys when you shifted back into the home
Yeah.
environment?
Yeah. I'd agree, but it's also a weird concept when you can say like, man, every single one of our kids is in a group, to then cutting that down because you're adding a different night to the rhythm, you know? And so if you want to talk about it from like a metric perspective, you're like, your groups like got cut in half potentially. And luckily, like when I pitched that vision to our church leadership, they were like, hey, this will take a while to like build up, but we do think it's the right call. um, which I'm grateful for, because I know other people that might just make that decision in isolation. And then, lead pastors are like, hey, how come kids aren't in groups anymore?
Well, I mean, I am curious because, like, I feel like every time we visited that conversation, and I'm sure there are going to be people listening to this that have wrestled with the same thing, is it's like
yeah,
it's like a wager, like to get your pro and your con list. It's like if you
Yeah.
keep your groups tethered to your large group program, like, I mean, I feel I've always struggled with the tension of the quality of that. Like you never know who you're going to get. The kid's like, this kid's just here to play basketball and hang out with his girlfriend. And now he's here and he doesn't really want to talk about anything, or,
Yeah.
he just got drug here with a buddy and he. Um,
Yeah.
but everyone has the opportunity to be in one, and everyone has that
Yeah.
touch point. But the flip
Yeah.
side is like the quality and the interest level. If it's hey, I'm raising my hand and I'm going to drive myself or have my mom drive me to this random house because I
Mhm.
really want to study God's word and I really believe in that and I want to chase after that. Like it's just going to be a different thing. How did you guys as a team wrestle with that balance? Because I think that's
Yeah.
something that I know that's a tension that every youth pastor's ever felt when it comes to how do we create effective disciple making environments,
Yeah.
because that's what we're called to do. And I know that there's
Yeah.
always that tension of like the onboarding, keeping the big front door, but how do we still do that?
Yeah.
So I'm just curious, how did you as a team and you as leading that team kind of lead your team through that process?
Yeah. So, and like I said, I'm grateful that this is a church, man. We have a pretty big safety net to fail, in a lot of different ways. And so there's been a lot of things we've learned and been able to change and improve from year one to year two to year three. Um, change is hard. People don't like change. And I love that we just had a lot of our leaders that were really so invested in that model that they really struggled with the concept. But helping to keep a lot of I wish it was by vision. Like, I honestly wish it probably was a little bit more by vision of, hey, this is what this could be. But so much of that was probably more of like, hey, the feedback we get from you guys is you feel like you're just not able to get there with your students. And in order to get there, I think it's going to take some sacrifice and some change. And that was for our team too, because then you have this concept of, man, do we just increase the expectation of our volunteers where they've been able to commit to one night a week? Do we make them commit to 2 nights a week now? And basically being able to say, hey, I think we need to recruit more people who can help lead like the more connection style on a Wednesday night for our program. And then if our home group leaders can do both, that's awesome. But our expectation of you isn't changing. We need you to be consistent for your group. So that might mean you're a little disconnected from what's happening in our student ministry, and like just kind of being okay with that. But the cool thing about that is we've been able to see students that have been connected more consistently in seasons that we used to lose them for long periods of time because of other sports and activities and things like that, because it's a different night of the week that they can stay connected to their group, to their leaders, and they're still growing in their faith. And so we had to go through that. I think an analogy that's been given to me, I don't know if like Kentucky's a big horse place, lots of horse farms, horse racing, all that other stuff too. Analogy was given to me once, man. If you open up like a gate on it, like in a field, a horse is going to roam every square inch of that to kind of get the sense of like what it has the ability to roam into. We opened our gates into really, really wide pastures first to the point that we were like, we might need to rein this in a little bit more, like with what, we gave them styles of Bible study that we wanted them to do because we want you studying the Bible together. But that might mean that every group is studying something different. And then that turned into, oh, we're going to read this other book instead of doing our Bible study, or we're going to do this video series and stuff. And it's like, all right, we're
That's a
making
lot
curriculum.
different than you're like,
Like,
we are doing this
yeah,
study. Like
yeah.
this is
And
the one for the semester.
some thrived
That's the
in
Bible
it,
study I'm going to
others,
with my home group.
and people are probably going to hear me say that and like, dude, you're an idiot. You should have written something to give them from the get go. But I mean, we lived, we learned, and we moved on. And like now we created like a really awesome resource that like our groups have been going through, that they're going to get to
Yeah.
dive in deeper on the core principles of the whole story of scripture in a whole school year.
Well,
Um,
and it's so different. It depends on your culture too. It's like, I
yeah.
just got done reading this micro church book about the Tampa Underground. And it's
Mm,
like their parameters for what constitutes a house church is pretty limited. I mean, are
yeah.
pretty broad. Like, they got a wide pasture to your analogy, but it works because they've just developed such a relational disciple making culture that
Yeah.
everyone understands. Like, yeah, like we do discovery Bible study. Like that's
Yeah.
what we do. And it's
Yeah.
just so ingrained in it that like, and it's so organic that they're like have all these groups that spring up. There's like thousands of groups all around Tampa that are connected with this house
Mm,
church deal, but because they had that culture drilled down so strong with their core, like
yeah.
the Holy Spirit just multiplied it out,
Yeah.
So I think that takes some kind of cultural awareness of like, okay, where's my team at? Where's the
Yeah.
spiritual maturity of my volunteers to be able to
Yeah.
handle like, man, how long of a leash can I give them? So
Yeah.
I think that
Yeah. So
there's
for our
every church is
team,
going to be a little different on that.
yeah, and so then for our team, that mindset shifted to, man, I've got to really be more intentional with how I go to my leaders for discipleship, for checkpoints, for training, for coaching conversations and things like that. Because I think we had gotten so accustomed to, man, they'll come to us and I at least have that touch point with them. And if I need to kind of dive in deeper, we can schedule a coffee, we can schedule a lunch. But that got them more on a rotation of, man, I'm gonna go into a different home group maybe every week and just go sit in, and like it kind of gets them out a little bit more. But part of the big driver behind this too, man, I think a lot of students are gonna go all the way through their time in elementary, middle school, and high school without a healthy view of the home. Like, I think so many more students are going to experience that. They are experiencing it. That culturally, I think, is just going to continue to be a really, really big thing. And so, for us to identify like families that we know and trust that are just hosting, they're not even the ones leading necessarily. And like being okay with the messiness of like, our kids are going to be around and it might be around bedtime, but for a kid to see how like a husband and wife tag team somebody's bedtime, that's going to teach them just as much as any Bible study. That's going to give them a frame of reference that I think is going to
I
help bring
agree
the
with that.
home. And so that was like another thing that, like, man, that's a value worth trying to instill. And if we can do that while also discipling students at the same time, that's awesome. And so,
Amen.
and honestly, the other thing too, this is something I kind of had in my notes and we might get into later, man. But like, I think sometimes we get so equipped, probably, honestly, I think a lot of us are trained this way that we're a student pastor in title only. What we're really pastoring in a lot of ways is more processes and ministries and like events and all that other stuff. This has allowed myself, like personally, but also a lot of my other high school pastors to actually step in because it's not tied to the program. So I lead a group of freshman guys on Sunday nights, and it's wild and it's nuts and all these other things, but honestly, it's making me a better student pastor. It changes the way I teach when I get to teach still, because it's not just this hypothetical or things that I'm hearing about
Yeah.
culturally students are dealing with. I'm face to face with students again, and in a big ministry in a church our size and stuff, to be able to do that is really, really valuable. And
I'm
so,
gonna guess, Eric, I'm gonna guess that's probably of your top two or three most life giving
oh
hours,
yeah,
2 hour
I
blocks of your
mean,
week, right?
yeah, and like I said, it's one of those things that, I mean, it changed the way I think about the content we write for our leaders because I'm like, okay, this was developed by me and our team. I struggle to get through it, you know, because we can have all these big grand ideas of what this is, but ultimately they need to talk about what happened at school this week. They need to be goofy. Like, I'm not like my guys that I lead in my group. Like, they play, like, they're big gamers and stuff like that. That's just not me. But like, we have fun together. We're goofy and we do get there sometimes. But man, it's okay just to like be reminded this is why I'm doing what I'm doing. And so for my team to be able to have that a little bit too, and not all of them do it, it's not like a requirement, but a lot of them want to. It's just been a really, really cool thing to kind of step back into that and actually be like, man, I get to pastor students. And I get it. That's probably a big church problem. But honestly, I think even in smaller churches, we're like, man, I don't want to do this on my own. I want to equip volunteers. Like, I want to pastor
Yeah.
volunteers so they can pastor students. And it's that trickle down type thing. And that's not bad. And I think it's pretty necessary in a lot of ways. But if in the process of that, you're completely removing your ability to actually just shepherd and disciple students, you'll probably get really tired of your job really quickly.
Well, I just think it's that age old principle, like good shepherds smell like the sheep.
Yeah.
Like it's about getting your hands messy.
Mm.
Or it's kind of the whole like I've heard somebody say this about your barista. If you like drinking coffee, say never trust a barista with white teeth. And it's like, man,
Yeah.
like yeah, if you can't really be a good pastor if you never hang out with people.
Yeah.
You're never going to be a great
Yeah.
evangelist if you don't ever hang out with lost people. If you're
Yeah.
never out in the harvest. That
Yeah.
concept is big in like a lot of evangelism heavy cultures. Like, if
Yeah.
you want to be an evangelist, you have to live life in the harvest. If you want to be, I think, is a great student pastor, you have to live life
Yeah.
with students, not just in their life, but also in your life. And I think for me, that's been a big conviction I felt in the last couple of years. I think coming out
Mm,
of COVID, I got way more private. I just didn't have
mm,
people over to my house as much. I just got
yeah,
way more about, just programming systems. And our church has grown, our youth ministry's grown, to your point,
yeah,
and I want to go there too, because I think, like, when it comes to, like, how do you not be the only person doing it? Because I think that's chronic
mm,
too, right? Is like, as a student pastor, you're like, okay, you could listen to that and be like, I'm crushing it. I've got 15 leaders and I've got my home group, but none of my leaders are doing it. And I don't know how to
yeah,
catalyze. I can tell them, hey, you should do this. But
mm,
how have you seen that trickle down happen and effectively trained and coached some of your volunteers to actually say, I see what you're doing, but, like, I have the conviction to disciple these students too, and really
mm,
own that. Because I think that's a jump that a lot of leaders struggle to make. They're like, hey, I can make it to the program. I can give you an hour a week, but that, like, no, that ownership, that shepherding, like, I view myself as a pastor of these kids. Like, these are the sheep that the Lord's put in my life. Like, that takes some really specific vision casting and training
yeah,
and ongoing encouragement and coaching to really drill that into your team. And it's a work of
yeah,
God, I believe, too, completely by the Holy Spirit.
yeah,
But how have you seen that happen with your team, and, from your pastors down to the volunteer level? Because I think that's
yeah,
probably the most, applicable thing from this. How do you do that?
yeah. I think a big part of that is just helping to keep things in their proper focus. Um, like helping them understand that like what actually is a win, I think is really important. Like that's kind of what's coming to mind right now, and the fact that, man, I used to have to like tell volunteers, dude, it's such a big deal that that kid wanted to play basketball again with you this week, and they're discouraged that their group time is a mess and like all this other stuff. I'm like, do you realize like how awesome that is that that kid wanted to come where you were playing basketball and like step back into that again a little bit? And then like seeing the fruit of that, of like, oh yeah, and then so and so actually talked, like when it came to like highs and lows, it wasn't just like, oh man, I got to eat this favorite thing, but it was like, man, I had this like really awesome experience with my dad this week, and like sharing real things and celebrating that to the same level that you celebrate like when a kid gets baptized, and like keeping that in front of them and realizing it's so much of it is those building blocks for things. And so, and even like within our team of student pastors, and this is something else that I kind of had like a thought on with one of the other questions he had sent me, was just like this concept of like, I realized when I moved into this role of like leading our team, when we'd get together every week after our programming, because our central, like our student team comes together from all of our campuses weekly. Like, so we drive from all over, like, the area, and we still sit down in person together with all these other student pastors from our church, like once a week, which is pretty rare in multi-site, especially as it starts to expand out. You try to like limit that amount of time and stuff, but I really value it. But I always noticed when we were talking about the week of ministry, so often their response to if they felt like it was a good night in ministry or a bad night in ministry was so correlated to the energy in the room, and the energy in the room was always about how many people were or weren't there. And I just said, I didn't do this right away, but like when I moved into my role and like leading those team meetings and stuff, I just said, hey, we're going to celebrate what we saw God doing and what those things were, and if it has anything to do with metrics, I don't want to hear about it. Like, I don't want to hear about how many people were there or not. Because if one kid shows up when you're used to 100, there's still such valuable ministry that's happening. And we have to look for that and celebrate that. And that's a culture thing, because then you're like, yeah, I want to include students in what we're doing, and I want to share those things. And then those little things, they're not little, they're actually really big, but what we think are little things, they turn into bigger things over time. And it's all about how are we sowing seeds? Parable of the sower. We're sowing, we're sowing, we're sowing. There's all different kinds of soil that are represented in the students that are a part of our ministry. And the tough part about student ministry is we hardly ever see the fruit of it. We hardly ever see the fruit of it. But I couldn't do what I do if I didn't believe that God was going to bring it to fruition someday. And so when we do get those little buds popping out of the rocky soil, we got to celebrate it, because that's God moving in those moments. And that was like a culture shift in the leader team that I led. And then I tried to bring that to like our team of student pastors when I started leading this. And we start to see and recognize more of what God's doing, as opposed to feeling like it's all on us for like what we need to entertain kids with or what we need to try and produce. And that was like the culture bit that I feel like has really kind of helped us think through. I don't know if that even really answers the direct question you asked me, but I do think that that is something when you talk about the how to. I think how we think about what we have just done or when we evaluate things, if it gets so tied up in how many are coming or like how like the big things that honestly the Holy Spirit has the most control over, we're going to beat ourselves up and we're going to get really discouraged and we're going to keep feeling like we don't know what we're doing.
Well, I just think you're going to get that measure what matters principle, which
Yeah.
is that name of that, that RKO book, which is all
Yeah.
almost about like the inverse of that. It's like, you know,
Yeah.
about tracking metrics, like
Yep.
results, objectives, key results is all
Yep.
about tracking and measuring and what do we measure. But even if, finding a way to like, man, how do we just measure like interactions, and
Yep.
like kids getting connected. Like maybe we just think like, while it's really hard to quantify that. I think what you're getting at is culture. You're like the
Yep.
way that we get our leaders discipling students is through culture.
Yep.
It's through not doing the team meeting on Teams or on Zoom. It's by making the drive every week and doing it in person, because we're going to
Yep.
ask our leaders to make the drive and meet in person, because we
Yep.
want the kids to go make the drive and meet the leaders in person. That
Yeah.
culture is like, it's like DNA that gets replicated.
Yeah.
Is that just kind of, as you're talking, what I'm hearing,
Yeah.
which is so powerful, Eric, just with the last few minutes of our time together, I don't want to, keep you all day.
Yeah.
I did want to talk through a little bit about how you help the kids get off the escalator, the walkie thing at the airport.
Yeah.
Um, when it comes to equipping and preparing them for ministry, yes, in high school, but how do you help them prepare to be mobilized? And I love that term, mobilization, um,
Mm.
into what the Lord has for them outside of high school, and not, you know, trip with the luggage, at the end of the thing, you
Yeah.
know, or just get handed a big pile of raw materials and handed a Bible and say, good luck, figure it out on your own, young
Yeah.
adult.
Yeah. I think the big thing, and this I think is a generational thing too, that I think a lot of like just youth workers need to be aware of. But man, asking yourself the question, how am I including students in what I'm doing? Like, is this just a bunch of adults doing ministry like at kids or like for kids, but they're like all on the receiving end of it? Because students want to be included. They want ownership. Like they want to be a part of it, and we have an opportunity to equip them. And this is important. Quality will dip. Like the quality will dip a bit, but the relational equity that we could build and discipleship that would happen as we walk alongside them, as we prepare them, is going to be invaluable. And so that's why like we have a big student leadership culture here, but student leadership isn't just like small group 2.0 where we dive deeper, but we're giving them aspects of the ministry that they can kind of help us plan, prepare with, and things like that too. And then like how we're equipping them to own it, because when they own it, they also want to include people in it, which is really, really important as well. So that's a big part of that. And then when they're not sure if they're equipped enough to do things or things like that too, that's where we get to really pour into them at a deeper level with like our home groups and those other things as well. It's actually like equip them for what that looks like. But another thing that we're in the process, I wish I had this figured out right now, but we're in the process of figuring that out, is like, man, how do we give them resources when it's time to move them out? When it's time to equip them to say, hey, whatever college campus you step on, whatever work field you're about to like kind of work it, like step into the workforce for and things like that too. Regardless of where you are, here are things and people we want to get you connected with. And I think some like smaller youth church pastors, like smaller church youth pastors that I know, they can really do this really personally for those students. And what I'm even trying to help our team get ready for is, hey, how do we even build that out that we could do that for the, 700 high school students that are a part of our ministry, that every single student knows where they can belong when this ends, and giving them practical steps. And we've shown them how to do that. The other thing that's been big for us is not having our program when our church stuff is like,
Yeah.
because now we see a lot of those students. I can't go on any of our campuses at Southland on a Sunday and see students serving. And they're serving in children's, they're serving in our guest experience team, they're serving in production for the weekend and all these other things too. And those are the kids I'm not worried about because they know how to function in the church.
That was one of
And
the things that, I went to a conference at Church of the Highlands a few years ago. And that was a really big philosophical shift that they made. Was I can't remember the
yeah,
Psalm 91, 92, that talking about, I don't want to misquote scripture, but the idea of like that those who are planted in the house of the Lord will flourish.
mm,
And it's the concept of like, they're like, hey, we stopped trying to fully disciple a kid by the time they were 18.
mm,
It's not going to happen.
yeah,
And he, the guy at the church, at the youth pastor breakout was like, how many of you here in the room are fully discipled? You feel like you're
yeah,
fully like Christ. How many of you guys still struggle, still reading your Bible and still figuring out how to follow Jesus? Of course, we all raise our hand. And he's like,
yeah,
exactly. Quit trying to
yeah,
like, you're going to kill yourself trying to like fully prepare the kid before they graduate. You're never going to be able to do it.
yeah,
What you need to do is you need to teach them to love and know Jesus, to like want to follow him and to love his church. He says, because if they love the church and they're planted in the church and they see church is not optional for me, like
mm-hmm,
I need Christian community. He says, those two things, that they need Jesus and they need his church, the Holy Spirit will take care of the rest. And
yeah.
I just
And I think
love
that's,
that. And so they just
yeah,
drove, they're like, we are going to get as many kids serving and building his church as possible. And I'm like,
yeah.
that is so brilliant. I loved that.
Yeah, and I think the ownership piece of that is good because, like I said, it doesn't just like if they feel like they own it, they want to also like they want to include people in what they feel ownership over. That's not just true of students; that's true of your volunteers. I think like we talk about this too, man. Your volunteers should be your best recruiters, like all those different
Oh
things as
yeah.
well. And that usually happens when they feel ownership over it. But the other equipping piece that we've really been honing in on a lot, and this probably is a little bit more like content based and stuff, but man, we've just made a commitment in a lot of different ways to say, man, we know that our students need to be equipped to be able to handle what's happening in culture. And so, like, just this huge need for like biblical literacy and to know what a biblical worldview looks like has been like a huge challenge. But it's also been the thing that I think our team and our church feels the most passionately about. And I think that's shaped some of that equipping. And so, like, our curriculum that our student team like makes for ourselves now, we used to always find stuff out there and things like that too. And that's a big part of my role now is getting to kind of help shape that, is helping students know, man, what does the Bible say? That's the literacy piece. Then how do I know it's true? Like more
Mm,
apologetics kind of a bin. And then how do I live it out? And that's like your biblical worldview and practices. And those are the three funnels of which every single one of our conversations, teaching series, small group stuff, all of that is going to be through one of those three lenses. And a lot of times they overlap in some ways, but that's just become such a high priority for us. And I think since we've shifted in that, we're hearing more of our students that come back from their first year of college like not afraid of the conversations that they had to have when they stepped onto a campus and things like that too. And so part of that is it's like not just talking at them about Jesus, but starting to really equip them for what like actually walking in step with Jesus will look like and how to prepare for challenges and things like that has been a big part of that, like teaching them to walk on their own.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think those are so key. And as far as like what that looks like played out, is that, do you kind of go through like whole seasonal campaigns? Like, hey, the content and preaching is going to be this. We're going to go through this as a student leadership team, or our home groups are
Mm,
going to be talking about all of that. Is it like a
yeah.
total encompassing thing that like, hey, once a semester we're doing a 5-6 week series on something biblical
Yeah.
worldview, or how does that play out?
Yeah.
Just in the sense of like, if I'm listening to this and I'm like, man, I like that concept, but I don't know exactly how it fits into the rhythm of the year.
Yeah. Yeah, so some of that's a little bit felt need, like based off the conversations we're having and stuff. But like, so I'm in the process right now of finalizing our teaching calendar for next school year. And what we do is I gather sermon series ideas, and my team knows when they present those to me that they have to fit in one of those three funnels. And then what I do is I kind of take those ideas, kind of see which ones, like I think just work really, really well, but also some of the ones that we've maybe saved that we haven't used yet. And I actually try to make sure there's a healthy blend of all of those throughout the course of a semester. And so that way, like if students are out during like certain seasons and stuff like that, they're hearing teaching content on worldview and practices. They're hearing stuff about that's like truly about equipping them with biblical literacy and the how do I know the Bible is true conversation. So it's not a true like scope and sequence in the fact that it arcs a certain way or things like that. Some of it's more of just like, we want to make sure that we're having a healthy blend of all three of those throughout the calendar year. And that's been a really fun project. Then honestly, our church is wanting to just help like be a resource, not just to us, but also to other churches as well. And so we've been trying to like compile what we've come up with over the last 2 years in a way that we can just share those resources with whoever wants it. We're not charging people for it or anything like that, which has been kind of a fun thing. And so, yeah, and some fun ideas and things like that have been really, really cool to kind of get out there and, uh, yeah, just dream. And it's cool because then our team feels like they're a part of it. Multi-site stuff, a lot of times you're given a plan to execute. But this actually still puts a lot of it on our team to help create that. And then they also get to kind of help execute that at the more campus level as well, which is really fun. So
It's amazing. Yeah, I'm definitely going to want to get my hands on that resource, and I'm sure that will probably be so many
yeah,
listening to this that may want to reach out and
yeah,
get their
man.
hands on some of that stuff, because I think that's super relevant as far as like, hey, how do we figure out what we're talking about, what we're teaching through in a really
Yeah,
systematic way, but also, like you said, is meeting felt needs, but is also teaching all of God's word as much as we can, and the
yeah,
short blip of a student's life. But that's super helpful just to see how you guys think through that. And are generous with that. So thank you just for the kingdom of God and you guys just investment in other people. That's really,
yeah.
really cool. Um, just before we wrap up here, kind of hitting the hour mark, maybe just some final words of encouragement or anything like, if you're a student pastor listening to this, you're a student leader, that's kind of the target audience of who's been tracking with this. Uh,
Yeah.
Anything that you're like, man, right now from a distance, having been in youth ministry, a long time, you're like, hey, where the world is going, in the cultural moment that we are, that we as pastors, as ministers, whether we're volunteers, staff, whatever that looks like, what's something that you feel like we can't miss this? That
Yeah.
if we need to double down on something right now, like this is the thing in the season and in the time that you feel like the Lord is just pressing on your heart, to encourage people to lean into. That's maybe more of like I don't want to maybe say like a prophetic word for people, but leaning in that direction of just like, hey, like this is what I feel like the Lord's pressing in right now for people to hear, and for your team to hear that you're seeing. So I would love for just see what God's putting on your heart to share.
Yeah, I mean, we could talk like cultural stuff. I think we've kind of hit on some of those different things. Like, my big thing is like, man, are we just doing this like for ad students without actually being in discipleship relationships with students? I've talked about that. Man, the thing I'm sensing a lot with my team and other conversations with other pastors that I'm having right now, our ability to actually be intentional about building in rhythms of rest is really important. I think a lot of us are really discouraged because we're constantly just sprinting to the next thing. We completely empty ourselves, and then it's only when our tank is on empty that we rest or we're forced to rest. And so, like, right now it's February 22nd. You and I are talking. Probably what a lot of people that are going to hear this is like next step on their plate. The big next thing is probably camp this summer. And so they're thinking about like details. They're trying to like get kids to sign up. They're trying to get leaders to commit. And then they're going to get there and they're going to be exhausted. And I would just encourage you, like, don't do that. Like, make rest a part of your preparation. And also, the other thing, part of that rest should be solitude. Um, that is a spiritual practice that youth pastors are horrible at because we love people. A lot of us are really big external processors. We want to be encouraged and around people and all this other stuff. And I think a lot of us don't know how to just be alone with the Father. So, man, I've had some conversations with people on my team recently that they're like, their wheels are constantly spinning on what we're going to do for our high school like beach week this summer from a programming perspective or trying to get people to sign up and things like that, and they're already tired and it's February. And I've just said, hey, I'm going to work with you to commit on how are you going to take a day once a month, like, and if it's work time to do that, how are you just going to rest? Because I think I just think that's such a bad habit that so many people have. And it might not even be about camp. It might not, I just feel like that's what we do in ministry. We're on to the next, we're on to the next, we're on to the next. And then honestly, when we get to it, we're probably not even at our best because we've just spent ourselves so much to try and really prepare for the thing that is such a big deal, but we haven't actually built rest into the preparation for that so we can be at our best for people when that time comes. And so that's kind of my kick right now with my team. Like, we do a team retreat every March. It's coming up in a few weeks, and that's fun, but it's also a lot of like vision casting, dreaming, stuff like that. We're going to rest. Like, we're going to eat good food. We're going to enjoy each other's company. I'm going to guide them through some solitude time, and we're going to rest before we get ready to take the hill again. But also, like, just how you get ready to do that is, it's such a huge part of preparation that I think we overlook, because like, stuff's not going to get done, or we set aside time to rest and then something else like we realize is falling short, and it's the first thing we compromise. And that's just from a work perspective. That's not even including making sure that like your family's not neglected, that your other community isn't neglected, and things like that too. Because honestly, it's just a reminder that when we don't do that, I think we think we're a lot more important than we actually are. And so that would be my encouragement, and my challenge, I guess, a little bit, is rest and try and do as much of that, not all the time, but make sure that a big part of that is just some time alone with the Father.
It's huge. Well, Eric, thanks so much, man, just for your time and just your wisdom. And I feel like we could go over and go another hour and talking more about, just
Probably could,
all the
man.
different ins and outs of what you guys are doing, and just what God's doing in your church and your life. But I just appreciate you sharing some of these things. If anybody's listening to this, wanting to get a hold of you, maybe they're like, hey, I'm interested in those resources that you're talking about. They might want to reach out. What's the
Yeah.
best way? Get in touch with you on social. Check out your church online. What maybe some ways to connect with you and with your ministry that you'd like to share with anybody listening?
Yeah, so like I said, I'm at Southland Christian Church in Lexington, Kentucky. You could find me on our website there. I'm on Instagram and X, whatever it's called now, things like that too. So, yeah, you can find me there. And then if it's the resources thing, we're building it out still right now. It should be ready to go with like our first 2 years worth of curriculum that we made, hopefully soon. But that would be like resources.southland.church, I think. Um, but my email is on our staff website, things like that too. I'm at Eric Schneid, EricSchneiD, on most social media stuff and things like that too. So, or just reach out to Ryan. Ryan can reach out to me. It'd be good too. So,
Love it. Eric,
yeah,
thanks
man.
for your time, brother. Appreciate you.
You bet. You bet, man.